Food Matters Network call. Today we have an exciting call from Environmental Law Institute that will be presenting on a new model policy that was in partnership with NRDC, which is the Model Ordinance on Advancing Community Composting, which provides off-the-shelf legal language that municipalities can adopt to reduce regulatory barriers for community composting. So with that, I will pass it to Linda and Taalin, who will give a brief overview of the model policy, and then we'll have some time at the end of the call where we can do Q&A questions if there are any outstanding questions on this resource.
Well, thank you so much, Anya. And I hope you all, since I consider it sort of like the Food Matters family, I will just tell you I am traveling. And so it's possible that my connection won't be ideal, in which case Taalin will pick up seamlessly and I will work on improving my connection. But it's really nice to see everyone today. Anya, thank you so much for inviting us. Taalin and I are going to trade off talking about our new model governance tools with NRDC, one with Institute for Local Self-Reliance as well. But first, we wanted to tee up the discussion with some background. I know some of the background about our models is going to be repetitive for some of you, and that some of our more general background on food waste and community composting are points that most of you are going to be very familiar with. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that background at all, but we thought it would be good for anyone who's newer to the group, and also in case some of the background slides are helpful to you in your work, you're more than welcome to use them in your own presentations. As most of you know by now, Environmental Law Institute is an international, nonpartisan environmental NGO based in DC, but I'm based in Nashville. And as of a few weeks ago, Taalin is based in Boston. So Environmental Law Institute folks are all over. We work on a wide range of domestic and international issues. We're essentially a publishing, education, research, and training center. And our food waste work is part of our Center for State and Local Governance, which builds the capacity of state and local governments and their NGOs and their communities and their businesses to address a whole range of sustainability issues. Our food waste initiative is part of the center's work, and we conduct research. We work with stakeholders to prevent food waste and increase surplus food donation and rescue, and to recycle food scraps. So our work includes things like research reports and model policies and policy toolkits and more, but we don't lobby. So we don't actually go into legislatures to get these policies adopted. We provide the resources. I do want to also mention a specific initiative you've heard us talk about over the years, the Nashville Food Waste Initiative, which, as many of you know, was started by NRDC and Darby Hoover in particular, who's on sabbatical now, back in 2015. And through the Nashville Food Waste Initiative, we focus on supporting efforts in Nashville to reach the goal the city has set of reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. I think we should be on the next slide now. Yeah, perfect. So ELI and NRDC have been working together for many years now to develop model policies and other governance tools. These models are intended to reduce the time and the resources required for municipalities and their communities to take action on addressing food waste. So we do the best practices research, as you'll hear more about, including interviews with experts. We then actually draft a model ordinance or executive order or policy. So by doing the legwork, basically, we hope to save a city council member or a mayor or a community group a lot of time and effort. It's worth a reminder that we are focusing on supporting cities on food waste reduction because they're on the front lines, right, of addressing the food waste problem. They're responsible for managing municipal waste. They play a role in addressing food insecurity in their communities. And increasingly, and ever more important now, they're playing a role in climate mitigation, right? And food waste reduction can help them reach their climate goals. We also all well know that municipalities are overstretched. They have incredibly wide-ranging responsibilities, and in many cases, particularly in the middle of the country, are just under-resourced and understaffed. So I want to hand it over. Well, actually, I'm going to do one more slide, but I also want to note we're going to be talking about municipalities, cities today, sort of interchangeably. Our models can be used by any type of local government. So depending on where you are in the country, it might be a town or a municipality or a county. So I just want to flag that they don't just apply to municipalities. Okay, so all of our models, as I said, are based on extensive research, online research, lots of qualitative interviews, and we're trying to find the best practices, like what is working out there. The models are adaptable to the needs of individual cities, municipalities. There are tens of thousands of local governments. I'll say more about this in a minute. So it may not be a one-size-fits-all situation, but for the municipalities that the shoe fits, we produce a version that can literally just be used off the shelf with no changes. We also provide a version of each model ordinance or executive order that has commentaries that provide additional information, including in some cases alternative approaches that a municipality can use if that off-the-shelf version is not a perfect fit. And as we'll tell you again, they all come with background memos. So we're going to focus on our new models today. I think Taalin, where's the list? It's really small on my computer, but if we could put the whole list up one more time, because I just want to say we're not going to focus on these today, except for our new one, but we would be delighted to talk to anyone post-webinar who wants more details on any of these models that are on our list, and our email addresses are going to be on the last slide. So before we talk about our new community composting ordinance and our new model resolutions, I'm going to hand it over to Taalin to do some basic background information on food waste and community composting.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. So as Linda mentioned, we know you all or many of you all are food waste experts, but we just wanted to give sort of the background on food waste that we typically give in these sorts of presentations. And as Linda mentioned, these slides are each model comes with a slide deck that includes some sort of background on food waste, so y'all are free to use that. So yeah, big picture background on food waste. As y'all know, over 30% of all food in the US goes uneaten, and that accounts for, and just sort of that uneaten food accounts for 4% of US greenhouse gas emissions, 16% of both US freshwater and cropland use, and 24% of the volume in landfill. In our work, we often refer to EPA's wasted food scale, which categorizes actions that prevent and divert wasted food from disposal based on its benefits to the environment and to a circular economy. As you can see, composting is an important complement to these food waste reduction strategies, and is especially important for food scraps like banana peels, corn cobs, and coffee grounds that are harder to prevent, donate, and feed to animals. So what is composting? Composting is a process of recycling organic material, such as yard trimmings and food scraps, into a valuable soil amendment known as compost. And it can occur across a spectrum of sites and operational scales, from home backyard composting to community composting to sort of large industrial facilities. This project focuses on community composting, which can take many different forms. It can operate at varying sizes and scales. And as such, the model's definition of community composting is left intentionally flexible. The key characteristics being that it sources organic material locally, or most or all of its material locally, and also distributes most or all of that compost locally. It occupies a smaller operational area and processes substantially less organic material than an industrial composting facility would. And it also typically engages the community in the composting process. And on the right, you can see a graph or sort of a diagram that I love from ILSR, sort of demonstrating this sort of closed loop of community composting. You might imagine that a restaurant produces food waste. That food waste gets picked up by a community composter. That community composter composts it, and then gives it to an urban garden, which then grows fresh fruit like fruit and vegetables that same restaurant might then use. And then the benefits of composting. As you'll know, composting diverts organic material from landfills and incinerators.
No, it's okay. What's up?
And this can prevent methane, which is produced when food waste and other organic material decomposes more rapidly than the other material in landfills and usually escapes the landfill gas collection systems. It can reduce disposal costs associated with landfill and incineration just by reducing the amount of material that is processed by these facilities. And because these facilities also tend to have harmful public health effects on nearby communities, it can help sort of the need for expansion and construction of new ones. Yeah, and then the benefits of compost use, so can decrease the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, help the soil retain moisture, and improve the soil's capacity to hold nutrients and sequester carbon, and therefore improve plant growth and also have some climate mitigation benefits. The benefits of community composting in particular. So community composting is designed to meet local needs, serve local interests, and engage the community. On the ground, this can look like education on food systems and sustainability for community members, local green space for these residents to enjoy, and also sort of job training and local jobs for kids in high school or other residents. And then also due to their local focus, community composters can be particularly efficient. They can streamline quality control by because they usually accept a narrower array of food scraps. And then they can also minimize transportation and distribution costs because they typically accept material from nearby. Many community composters pick up compost on bikes and also distribute that same compost locally. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Linda now to talk about a new exciting project.
Thanks, Taalin. And, again, just want to reiterate, our slides are posted on the NRDC website and the ELI website. But if you want a version, like if it would be helpful for you to have this nice condensed slide on, why community composting, just let us know because we can, send the actual PowerPoint slides to you. Anya, could I ask you, I would be happy to take questions as we go. It's going to start getting a little denser in terms of the substance. And so I am really bad at checking the chat or the raised hands as I am speaking. So just please interject, or we'll obviously take questions at the end as well, but feel absolutely free. I'll pause a little bit as we go from sort of section to section. So Taalin, I guess we are going to go, we're on the model resolutions. Good. Okay. So all of the model governance tools that we have done to date impose some kind of requirements, right? They require the municipality or they require private entities to do something to reduce food waste. What we have now done is develop what we're calling companion resolutions for each of the model ordinances that were on the list on that earlier slide. So resolutions are measures adopted by a city council or other legislative entity. In some parts of the country, it's not called a city council, it's called a commission. But unlike ordinances, resolutions typically simply are an expression of municipal support for something, right? It's basically the city council making a statement that a particular issue is important to them, right? And important to the city. In some cases, resolutions can also establish legislative committees to further research and evaluate an issue, essentially determine whether the city council should take further action in the form of an ordinance. The reason we did this is what we've seen over time with our models is that sometimes it's just too challenging in some jurisdictions to enact an ordinance on an issue that the council or mayor has not even really considered or grappled with before, right? They need some kind of ramp up before they can just like jump in and do an ordinance. Enacting a resolution is not a heavy lift, right? City councils adopt a lot of resolutions, as I'm sure you've observed over time. So, for example, in Nashville, where I'm located, the city council adopted a resolution expressing support for reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. It hasn't adopted any other requirements yet, but what I've observed firsthand is that this resolution has served to raise awareness of the issue in Nashville, even though it didn't establish any requirement. And so it's getting people thinking, well, like, how are we going to reach that goal, right? Even though the goal is not binding. If we go to the next slide. So the new model resolutions we've developed with NRDC express support for a range of food waste reduction measures, depending on which ordinance it accompanies. And several of them also establish legislative committees, as I mentioned, that are tasked with considering whether to adopt specific food waste reduction requirements. And specifically, we, of course, reference our own models as a good place to start and decide whether you want to take action. So again, we're hoping that the model resolutions can serve as a first step toward the eventual enactment of an ordinance or adoption of an executive order or policy that will establish permanent rules or requirements for addressing food waste. So let me pause there for a minute because we're going to move to the community composting ordinance. If there are any questions or reactions. Okay. All right. Next slide. Okay, so we next want to talk about our new model ordinance on community composting. But before I do that, some of you may recall that this is our second model ordinance on community composting. We did two because the first issue we really needed to address was zoning, right? Land use is its own thing from a legal perspective. So we wanted to first address that separately because if you think about it, if land is not zoned for community composting, then no further efforts to remove regulatory barriers or to incentivize community composting is going to matter, right? So the goal of that first model ordinance on zoning was to remove potential zoning code barriers to community composting. And I'm just going to remind you all a little bit more about what this is about because it really is sort of very basic and a very widespread challenge when it comes to community composting, because even though community composting can provide many benefits to municipalities, as Taalin was discussing, and to their communities, it can nevertheless be barred in certain areas under typical zoning codes that we're all familiar with that regulate by land use types like residential or industrial. So if you go to the next slide, the first community composting model that we did establishes and regulates essentially community composting as a clearly defined and permissible land use in the 5 most common zoning districts, which are listed there. So but it's a little bit different depending on the zone. So in industrial and commercial zones, the model provides that you can do community composting operations as a matter of right. I mean, someone can always challenge it, but like the starting ground is you get to do community composting. But in residential zones or mixed use zones, it's permitted, it's a permissible land use, but it's subject to a conditional use permit. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to say one word about this because I think people get a little bit confused. They're like, wait, what a minute, you're going to have this in the middle of my neighborhood. That is not the case. So the way it works in a residential area where community composting is a conditional use, this is under this model that we've produced. What this means that certain conditions have to be met first, right? So for example, in order to do a community composting operation, you're going to have to submit a plan that shows things like landscaping and buffering that's going to screen the facility from adjacent residential properties, or you're going to have to show that the facility isn't going to negatively impact surface water or groundwater. And of course, probably most importantly, that the facility has a plan for addressing odor, pest control, and traffic impacts. So I just wanted to start with that reminder about the first community composting model ordinance on zoning. And now we're going to turn to our new model, which covers a lot of other aspects of community composting. I'm going to turn it over to Taalin to introduce the new model that we did with NRDC and this time also ILSR.
Yeah. So like Linda mentioned, this model is a collaboration between NRDC, ELI, and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. It's based on extensive research and best practices. It builds upon our previous model zoning ordinance, relies on ILSR's extensive resources and expertise, and like all our models, it can be tailored to the needs of individual municipalities. Specifically, we sort of give background information and alternative approaches through a version with commentaries as well as a background memo. So this model, the Model Municipal Ordinance to Advance Community Composting, is intended to address specific local level barriers. So as you'll know, community composting operations must comply with municipal law, but laws across municipalities across the country can vary a great deal. But common areas of local regulation include nuisance and public health protection, floodplain management, hauler licensing, compost distribution and sale, and procurement. And some of these laws may impose on community composting operations a burden that is unintended, unnecessary, or disproportionate to the expected benefit of applying their requirements. So what this means is that basically we're seeking to remove unreasonable barriers to community composting. Some, regulations are good and beneficial in the public interest, but some might not have been intended to apply to community composting operations, or some might be maybe unnecessary in sort of protecting the public from whatever it was intended to do. Or they might be sort of the cons of that regulation might outweigh the benefits. So that's sort of what we're seeking to address. The model also seeks to address potential state level barriers. And obviously this is a municipal model ordinance. So, that can't really eliminate or do anything, like specific against a state level law because it's not the same jurisdiction. But the model does sort of provide some ways for a municipality to identify state level barriers and communicate those barriers to the state level entity. And it sort of names some of the specific areas like solid waste management and protection of water and air resources that may regulate one or more aspects of community composting operations. So with that, I'll turn it back to Linda to walk us through the specific provisions of the model.
Right. So that's a great introduction and overview. And now we're going to dive in and go through each of those, and we'll pause for questions as we go. And let me just start with a warning if it isn't already clear from what Taalin has said in the discussion of solutions and the zoning ordinance. And here I am quoting an SELC publication, quote, "The legal life of compost is far more complex than one might imagine." And I just always think about that because it is incredibly complex. And so just a little warning on that. It's because community composting operations can involve various activities, and the potential impacts that can implicate a whole range of different regulatory regimes. And you'll see as we go through this. And I mean, the other, part of it is that the laws vary so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? And this is a good time to remind everyone that there are almost 20,000 incorporated cities, towns, and villages in the United States. And about 3/4 of those have a population of less than 5,000. Right. So, we're trying to give a general overview. It's why models are so important, that people around the country have something to start with. But, this is a challenge. So with this fun fact in mind, let's look at the new model. Okay, so to start off, the ordinance requires that the municipality establish and track progress toward an annual measurable goal for supporting community composting operations within the municipality. And the model lists sort of options for how a municipality may want to state this goal, such as how many community composting operations they want to aim to have within the municipality, or the volume of organic material they seek to have processed by community composters, or the volume of compost that's distributed by the community composting operations. Again, the idea here is that if a city sets goals for community composting, it's going to help them move forward with the actions needed to reach the goal. But again, the goals are probably going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction based on circumstances. And Anya, you're going to let me know if anyone raises their hand with a question about any of these. Okay, so probably the most important thing that the model requires is that the municipality develop an inventory of existing ordinances and regulations that may apply to community composting. And then to identify whether these existing ordinances and regulations present an unreasonable barrier to community composting. And then it requires the municipality to reduce or eliminate those barriers to the extent practicable. The model ordinance, as Taalin said, addresses 4 very specific regulatory subject matter areas that are very common barriers to community composting, although again, it's going to vary from city to city. So we're going to walk through each of those in the next slide. Okay, so as I noted, the ordinance requires the municipality to review, compile, and maintain an inventory of municipal ordinances and regulations that could apply. And the inventory must be published and updated regularly. And this action in itself could be very helpful to community composters just so they know what they're dealing with, right? And what could apply to their operations. We go to the next slide. Once a municipality has identified the applicable ordinances and regulations, it next has to determine whether they present the unreasonable barrier. And I just want to, clarify, as Taalin said, what we mean here and the way we define it in the ordinance is a regulatory requirement, such as a local permitting requirement or a permit condition that imposes on a community composting operation a burden that is unintended, unnecessary, or disproportionate to the expected benefit of applying the requirement. As Taalin said, the idea here is that there are a lot of regulations on the books, and some of them may be inadvertently deterring community composting or simply unnecessary. So the model is not trying to get rid of all regulation of community composting. That would actually be counterproductive. The point is to get rid of the unnecessary, unintended restrictions that just don't make sense given the benefits. And then after the unreasonable barriers are identified, they have to take steps under the model to remove or eliminate the barriers. And again, this may and probably will require amending a municipal ordinance or regulation, which is, not an easy thing to do, but at least identifying that is the first step. So let's look at some specific examples of ordinances and regulations that could be implicated here. And these are, as I say, pretty, common ones. So a key place to look for barriers are municipal ordinances or regulations on nuisance, right? So these are regulations that would address, for example, how nuisance determinations are made at community composting sites due to odors or rodents or pests. The model suggests that municipalities consider amending these regulations, if they're a barrier, to require that determinations about nuisance are made by considering whether best practices are used or were used at the time and are continuing to be used. So a best practice, and we give some examples in the model, would be, that all open compost piles are surrounded by a minimum of 2 feet of empty space at all times. And again, the idea here is that rather than determining nuisance, as some cities do, for example, on the existence of one rodent on the premises, which of course, trash cans with food scraps also attract rodents, that regulators should be looking at whether the operation is well managed, right? Because that's a good indicator of whether it would be reasonable to find that there's a nuisance. All right, next, if anyone has questions about that. Okay. Another common way that community composting can be unreasonably restricted in regulations are those regulations intended to protect floodplain and flood-prone areas. And again, these are important regulations, just like nuisance regulations. So the model simply requires that the municipality not overly restrict community compost operations in floodplains. It does this by requiring that cities not have more stringent regulations than necessary to meet any state and federal requirements for floodplains. And that's a whole complicated area of law and policy, the state and federal laws. But what we want to make sure is that a city isn't being even more stringent in terms of what can be on a floodplain. And again, it may make sense in some cases not to have a community composting operation on a floodplain, but at the same time, we've seen cases where community composting is being swept in under regulations when it really doesn't make sense to restrict them in a flood-prone area. So what we're trying to avoid are these like flat prohibitions of not building or operating at all a community composting in a 100-year floodplain. Okay. If there are no questions, we'll go to the next. All right, so another area of regulation that can unreasonably deter community composting are requirements related to waste haulers. So the model provides that a person transporting organic material exclusively as part of a community composting operation is exempt from municipal licensing requirements that would apply to large waste haulers generally. So it's essentially a carve out, right, from standard licensing requirements, so that a community composting operation, that small scale, and we've all seen the pictures of the people on the bicycle, biking around and picking up the food scraps. Like, we don't want that woman to have a license, right, from that goes through the same laborious process that a hauler, that's hauling tons and tons of waste a week, right? And another point in the model ordinance is that municipalities should not enter into or renew exclusive franchise zone arrangements or other private contracts for solid waste hauling that would have the effect of unduly restricting the ability of a community composting operation to collect organic material. And again, you all are probably familiar with this. Some cities do these franchise zones where they like pick certain number through a bidding process of who can haul the municipal solid waste. And in some cases, those haulers, have said, oh, you little guy who's going around the neighborhood, you can't do that because we have an exclusive on this, right? And that's not what we want those contracts to do. We want to carve out, again, community composting. If there are no questions, let's go to the next one. We're working our way through. We just have a few more. So another really interesting and very complicated area of regulation that the model ordinance addresses are requirements imposed by homeowners associations, condominium associations, or owners of multifamily residential dwelling units that are prohibiting or some way restricting unreasonably the people who live there, the residents, from arranging for community composters to collect organic material. I really understand this, having moved into, for the first time, a homeowners association, and there are a lot of rules. So what we would want this model ordinance to do is say, an example of what this might be is like, you can't put your little bin out on a walkway at the condominium building so that it can be picked up by a composter. We're not going to let you do that. That would be an example of this. And so what the model ordinance suggests is that municipalities consider, it's not a mandate, but consider amending their ordinances and regulations to reduce or eliminate such restrictions, which several have done. And I think I saw, is there someone from Austin on? Because our understanding is that Austin has done something to address this problem. And again, as I said, the model just says consider doing this because, as you might imagine, it's always very sensitive when you're telling people what they can and cannot do on private property. All right, I think we can go to the next.
There's a question from Caroline from Washington, D.C. She was wondering if there's any advice on how a municipality would check to see whether an HOA has things like this.
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a great question. I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out because I think that's a really good, because I mean, you can obviously do it on a case by case basis, with people complaining, or you could, have a place, specifically designated for people to report this. But that is a great question. And, I'm sure I know some people I can ask that question, because if you really wanted to, do this well in a municipality, you would need to understand your universe of like, how big is this problem? But I'm wondering if there might be associations, like trade associations of homeowners associations, right, in any given city that might be able to do that kind of check. I mean, because you can figure it out on a one-off basis, but the question is, could you in some way do that survey? So that's a great question. No one's ever asked us that. Okay, I'm seeing there's a lot of stuff in the chat, which I can't read. Is there anything else?
Angel just pointed out that in Ohio, you would be able to identify that through a property deed, and he bet that it might be the same in other states. And
Yes.
Angela from Austin will have to check with their solid waste management team if they have done something like this before.
Okay, that sounds great. And what you guys will see in the version of our model, and we're going to have links to it at the end, there are commentaries, as I said, which are essentially footnotes. And in the footnotes, we have examples. So I'm pretty sure like we have actually a citation, if not a link to the Austin ordinance that we thought addressed that addresses this. So, and what we find sometimes is there's an ordinance on the books. It doesn't necessarily mean it's being consistently, enforced or implemented. You'll be happy to know this is the last subject area of regulation that the model addresses. And this is on both the distribution and sale of compost and also the procurement of compost and composting services. So first, the model requires a municipality to determine whether any of its ordinances or regulations govern the distribution of sale of compost, and whether, again, are these rules imposing any unreasonable barriers on community composters? And if they are, the model, again, asks the municipality to consider amending the ordinance or regulation to get rid of these barriers. And again, I'm always making this distinction between a mandate and, please consider doing this. And it's mainly because we're trying to assess sort of the feasibility and the tremendous political barriers to doing some of these things. An example here would be, rather than being subjected under municipal law to extensive and expansive testing requirements that might be applicable to a large commercial composting operation, that maybe a community composting operation could instead be made subject to sort of a little less, rigorous standards. So maybe performance-based standards. There's something called PFRP, process to further reduce pathogens. They would just have to, adhere to those, to that process, or it could be a requirement that community compost operators be trained on operating under best management practices. So again, trying to make sure that community composting operations aren't inadvertently being treated like a huge commercial operation would be treated. And then lastly, the model requires a municipality to review its procurement code and any implementing regulations and policies. And once again, to the extent appropriate and practicable, to, remove any unreasonable barriers. And again, the goal here is to encourage the procurement of locally produced compost and food scrap composting services, right, provided by community composters. So for example, a municipality could consider procuring food scrap collection or drop-off sites through contracts with community composters. And again, procurement, its own can of legal worms. And so I want to remind everyone that we do have a model policy on compost procurement that does a lot deeper dive on this. I have one more thing to discuss before we break, but does anyone have any questions? All right, so the last issue I want to discuss before handing it back to Taalin, and Taalin mentioned this in his introduction, that state laws are different, obviously, than local laws. And from a legal perspective, this is a bit complicated because cities are basically created by states, right? So in the law, in the case law, judges refer to cities as creatures of the state, right? State laws take precedence over local laws, and states can preempt local laws. If you live in a blue city and a red state, you're probably very familiar with that. So even if a state law unreasonably restricts community composting, a city really can't do anything from a legal perspective about changing those laws. And in fact, all states do have programs that regulate solid waste, and that could in fact implicate community composting. However, someone just pulled up next to me with very loud music. However, because of the nationwide variation among state solid waste management programs, including differences in how these programs treat community composting operations, the applicable regulatory requirements, including any facility permitting requirements, for example, that's often at the state level, those may or may not apply to community composting depending on the state. So, for example, some states have actually provided for community composting sites a carve out from other solid waste permitting requirements, whereas others have super broad definitions of facilities such as transfer stations, and in those jurisdictions, a community composting operation could qualify, so to speak, as a transfer station. And just also flagging that in some cases, state stormwater requirements could apply to community composting operations, and in a very few cases, in places California, state clean air regulations could apply to community composting. And lastly, in some cases, states can regulate some aspects of compost sales, and in some cases set nuisance standards as well that could apply to community composting operations under their general state waste management regulations. So what the model does is it requires a municipality to review and compile and maintain an inventory of state level laws and regulations that may apply to community composting. And again, this is useful in and of itself to somebody who wants to start a community composting operation, who's running one, to have it all pulled together in one place. And then the municipality may, they're not required to, but they could, if they want, identify any state level laws that present unreasonable barriers, using that same definition of what's unreasonable. And then again, up to the city, but we want to suggest that they may want to communicate these determinations about unreasonable barriers and recommend options for addressing them to the responsible state entity. And again, there's no requirement to do this because, as we know, municipal and state relations can be complicated and they may have differing agendas. So this is really up to each municipality about what makes the most sense in terms of whether to flag a problem for state regulators or not. Okay, so that was a lot of information. You can see why we wanted to try to take on regulatory barriers, because there are potentially a lot of them, and they can stem from a whole range of regulatory subject areas. So we're really hoping that the model can provide a roadmap for removing those barriers. And so now on to the so much happier part, right? We can set all the regulatory negative stuff aside, and Taalin's going to talk about what the model ordinance says about providing incentives and positivity for community composting operations. Taalin?
Yeah, so the model also outlines several ways that a municipality can pursue opportunities to advance community composting. So this can happen by promoting public awareness and education around community composting. For example, participating in existing awareness campaigns. The municipality can also provide or work with a third party to provide technical assistance to community composters. And the municipality can also provide financial assistance or help in securing financial assistance for a community composter. The most obvious example that comes to mind is providing like grants, but this can also take the form of providing free or subsidized in-kind contributions, such as access to municipal lands or free like composting bins. And then the last provision is just for the municipality to issue an annual public report measure on the effectiveness of the measures measured against the goals that are set out in the goal setting section. So that is it for our model municipal ordinance on advancing community composting. Just wanted to sort of give you all sort of some direction on where to find these tools. So the first one, if you go to this link, which I'll put into the chat after the presentation, this has all of the resources associated with the first ordinance. So you'll find the full model ordinance with and without commentaries, the accompanying background memo, slide deck, and also the new model resolution. Same with this link on the second community composting ordinance. So all 5 resources on this one central hub. And that's how it works for all 6 model governance tools, is that each one has its own sort of central hub of tools. But if you want one central landing hub for all 6 projects and all their accompanying tools, you can go to this first link here, which I'll also put into the chat, that has all of the NRDC and ELI model policies as well as their accompanying tools. And then our 3 sort of organizational main websites as it relates to this project, our Center for State and Local Governance website, NRDC Food Waste Reduction website, and ILSR's Community for Composting for Community initiative. And then if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to Linda or me. On NRDC side, I know Darby's on sabbatical, so maybe Anya can tell us who to reach out to. But from ILSR, it would be Brenda, Sophia, or Julia. And that's it from us.